The LWS Sewn Adaptive Bomber Jacket Sew-Along. First, we'll start with fit. Typically with commercial patterns, the size chart is a range of sizes, range of measurements, plus ease, which lends itself to a lot of error. How to choose your jacket size. When selecting your size, refer to the finished garment measurements on the size chart. I designed this chart intentionally to reflect the final dimensions of the jacket rather than the traditional body measurements. Since this jacket is adaptive first, it's designed with a more fitted silhouette, especially for those who use mobility aids. Less ease prevents excess fabric from interfering with the wheels or getting soiled. However, the design remains universal and works for everyone. Steps to find your final size. Start with your bust measurement. Compare it to the finished garment measurements. Decide on your ease preference. For a very fitted look, choose a size with 2 inches of ease. For a more standard fit, go with 4 inches of ease or more. Example, my bust measurement is 40 inches. For a snug fit, I'd choose a small, 42 inches finished bust. For an average ease, I'd go with a medium, 44 finished bust. Pick the size that best suits you. So I like to block fuse all the pieces that need to be fused. So the front facing, the welt facings, and the placket. I block fuse them on my big press. Once everything is cut out and you have fused all the pieces that require the interfacing, the first thing I like to do is attach the front facing to the front lining. It's just along this curve, 1/2 inch seam allowance. You instantly have the insides of your fronts, and I like to start with it because it has you starting off right away feeling successful. So one pro tip, when you are sewing lining to your self fabric or a lighter weight, silkier fabric to a heavier one, have your lighter fabric be on top. It will help from it shifting and things will match up more evenly, easier. I like to batch assemble my sleeves, the lining and the self fabric, the upper sleeve to the lower sleeve, as you can see here. And the important thing to remember, I'm doing 2 jackets here, so that's why there's 4 sleeve linings. But the important thing to remember is in one of your sleeve linings, you need to leave an opening for turning the jacket out when the jacket is complete. Just one. I give myself a generous opening, especially because I do so many that are with quilts, and so it's really thick. But this will be how you, birth the jacket at the end of sewing, and then you just sew it closed at the end. I like to batch all the things that I can do kind of in advance before I start construction. So this is the waistband, and this is the placket pieces. And you sew those 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch. The only thing to remember is if you have your placket pieces are a print, a continuation of the self fabric that's up here, you want to make sure that you lay it out in front of you and lap over whichever direction, male or female, that your jacket is going to lap over. And just make sure that you like the way the print, both pieces look side by side. So kind of like that, but lapped over. But that's only if you're doing a print. This is solid, so I just sew it together, there and there. So like I said, I like to prep all of the individual pieces before I start assembling. It just makes everything, in my opinion, go faster. So you have the placket to the waistband. You've pressed the wrong sides together for your collar. And I sew together right sides together, sew the cuffs, press it open, fold it in half. So these are all the way ready to be attached. I assemble the sleeves, leaving the hole opening for the lining, and I assemble the self sleeves. In this case, I did a little detail. Instead of piping, I used a zipper. And then I will just fold this side over, stitch 1/2 inch, and both sleeves will be done. You don't need a hole in the self fabric sleeves, just the lining, and only for one sleeve. Okay, so now we're gonna do the placement of the welts and all the prep for the exterior welt pockets. A couple little tips. I usually stay stitch any of the curved seams that potentially can get stretched. So 1/4 inch, I stay stitch the collar front or the neckline front, and I also do the same for the back. Also, this is the time before you start assembling. This is the time to do any of your patches, or in the case of this custom client, a logo embroidery. If you're going to put embroidery, if you're going to put trims, if you're going to do anything like that, before you start assembling, you want to place and attach those things. Because once you get started and you make the outside and then you make the lining, once it's together, you don't want to see stitch marks or anything on the inside. You want it to be as clean on the inside as it is on the outside. So there's that. Okay, so in the pattern, I give you the exterior welt chalking template. And that's just so that everything is really accurate and really easy to see and place everything. The key with welt pockets is precision, as far as the width of the welt, the length of the welt, making sure that you're stitching exactly at the start and stop positions. So I take this template. I've already marked the pocket marking, which is on the pattern for my size. And you're going to line the bottom corner to those marks. So those marks are the bottom of the welt opening. And then I take chalk, and I use a chalk that disappears with heat. So you chalk that box, which is a 3/4 inch welt, single welt. And you're going to do that on both sides. Then I take a ruler and I go exactly half of that box, and I will chalk a center line. Now your pocket facings, your welt pocket facings, this is your exterior welt pocket facings. This is the self, and this is the lining. You have 2 of each, a pair for each pocket. I have cleaned up the edge of the self fabric, and I have folded under, cleaned up, but folded under the edge of the lining. This is the facings that are inside the pocket that give it that completely clean, seamless going from the self fabric into the pocket. So what you want to do for these is I use a disappearing ink marking pen this time instead of the chalk because it's dark in color, and on the wrong side you are going to mark a 1/4 inch seam allowance on all your pocket welt facings for both the self fabric welt facing and the lining. And the pattern doesn't tell you to fuse the self pieces. It just has you cut 2 of fuse for the lining pieces to give them stability. And I did that because most of the time I do quilts, and so this piece is already very thick and stable. This is denim, so I went ahead and fused it anyway. That's totally up to you and depending on kind of the weight of the fabric you're using. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take your pocket bag piece, your pocket bags, and you're going to place a pocket bag piece underneath with the right side of the fabric facing the table, because this is what will be the inside of your pocket. So you want the right side of the fabric inside your pocket. And I lay it underneath the welt pocket. Just bring one over. And I check to make sure that the curved part is facing down towards the bottom of the jacket. And I just eyeball it. So I give myself a good 1.5 inches above the top line of the welt. And then I check the sides. I'm going to bring this up a little so there's a good 1 inch on either side. And then one thing I like to do is I like to put a pin up here so that while we're sewing and manipulating, that doesn't go anywhere. I have had to unpick many times because it did. And then I put one at the bottom of the pocket bag down here, just so nothing goes anywhere. I mean, if you want to be really protective, I mean, you can put one here and here as well. It's just temporary to hold everything in place so nobody shifts and moves, and you have those distances on either side of the opening on the back. Okay, so now that all the welt pieces are prepped, you have the pocket bag pinned underneath, you're going to take your welt. In my case, I used leather. This is the piece in the pattern. You fold it exactly in half, you press it so it's exactly in half, and then draw the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you line that line up with the bottom line of your pocket opening that you've chalked. And you want to make sure that you have a tab of at least 1 inch on either side. So you put that in place, making sure it's on the line. You'll notice you're not quite to the center of the box. That's correct. Then you're going to take the lining piece of your facing, so the welt facing, the lining piece, and you're going to line that up directly on top of your welt piece. Then you're going to take the self-facing piece and you're going to line that line on top of the upper line of the welt box. And again, it's not quite to center. Making sure that these sides line up so that you're giving yourself that 1-inch tab on either side. You can put pins in. Because mine is leather, I probably won't. If I did anywhere, it would be down here where it's not with the welt. You can also use a little double-sided, if you have like the 1/4-inch double-sided tape, to tape your welt piece down if it's something other than fabric that you can put a pin through it. But then you're going to stitch a 1/4 inch starting at the ends of the box. And another thing that I like to do is I like to draw those ends on my welt facing pieces perpendicular to my seam allowance lines so that I know exactly where to start and stop. So then you go over to your machine and you're going to sew these parallel lines. That's all. Don't worry about the ends. Start, stop. So now I've stitched both those parallel lines down. One thing that I'll do sometimes is I'll just turn it over and check and make sure that I'm really straight, that those lines are parallel, that they're the same distance apart all the way down, that I stopped and started at the same place. This is going to give you the most accurate welt. So just a refresh. You have your pocket bag. You have your welt. You have your lining welt facing. You have your self welt facing. Now we're going to cut this open through all the layers. I like to start about 5/8 away from the end. I use a rotary cutter. I cut through all the layers till about 5/8 before the other end. And then I take my scissors and I will cut the Y to the corner. And you want to get right up to where you started stitching, not through, but right to on all 4 sides, like that. Now you're going to fold everything to the inside. And if you cut to those corner points sufficiently, it will fold out nicely and you won't have too many say not pleats, but you want it to be very flush and flat. So I pull all the tabs out of all the sides. I fold these triangles back that you cut on both sides. And I will typically go over with an iron and just press those, but you'll be able to see when you turn it over how clean the corners are. This is pretty good. This one I gotta sort of stuff the triangle in there, but otherwise it's pretty good. So I'll press those triangles in place. You fold the lining down to the pocket bag. I'll pin that for just a second. And then the secret to your welt is then you fold the self-facing down towards the bottom of the pocket bag. Said I still got to press that. Roughly it'll look like this. So press the triangles, pull this facing, self-facing down, make sure everything is pulled out nice and tight. And then you're going to go to your sewing machine and you're going to sew through right up against this. You're not going to catch anything that's folded this way. You're just going to sew through the self-facing, that triangle, your welt, and you're going to stop right to the lining facing, and you're going to do that on both sides. So now you're going to take the other pocket bag and you're going to line it up on top folding everything out of the way, making sure that you're just sewing the self-facing to the pocket bag. Okay, so the welt pockets are done, and this is probably the most, I'm going to say, involved. It's not difficult. It's just, you know, multiple pieces to get the pockets done. But once those are done, everything else goes pretty quickly. So you have your two fronts. You're going to take your back piece, line up the shoulders. You're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance there, and you can go ahead and do that, line up your side seams and do a 1/2 inch for there. And if you want, you can pause and do the same for the lining pieces. So I start by doing the shoulder seams, 1/2 inch seam allowance, lining up the shoulders there at the neck, 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then press that open. I like to baste the collar piece on next. You do that to the right side, 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you can do the side seams. The most significant part with placing the placement of the collar is you have a top notch right here at the center front of the neckline. You want to line the collar like straight up and down, put a pin in, and then bring it around and curve it. This notch is important, and if you have it straight up like that and then work your way around, it just looks really nice when it's, you know, sandwiched in between the self layer and the lining. So now the outside of your jacket is all assembled. You will put in your sleeves on it, but before you do that, you're going to do the same thing you just did for the body of the jacket to the lining of the jacket. So front pieces, shoulder seams at a 1/2 inch, side seams at a 1/2 inch, and then we're ready to install the lining sleeves as well as your self-face fabric sleeves, as well as your sleeves to the outer part of your garment. So now we're ready to set in the sleeves, and this is a 2-part sleeve, as I covered in the beginning. And the way you figure out kind of the back of the sleeve versus the front of the sleeve is, this is the lower half of the sleeve, the smaller piece, and this is the upper. The longest seam that puts these together is the seam that's on the back side of the jacket. So it's the back of the sleeve. Whereas the shorter seam is the closest to being like the side seam. It doesn't have, it's not a side seam per se, and you can see there's a notch in the center of the lower sleeve piece. That notch matches up to the side seam. So your notches are really important to be sure and clip, because this will line up to the underarm side seam of the jacket. So because the longest seam is on the back, and I have this zipper just as an accent detail. I don't call for it in the pattern, but you can put piping. You know, really you can kind of put anything decorative if you want. I wanted to specifically for this client's jacket, just to give it a touch of something. Otherwise it's it's just a regular seam. I just put the zipper tape into the seam. So right sides together, I start with that side seam and that notch under the armpit that I mentioned. And then you go from there. You'll notice there's a notch immediately that you line up. There's a notch up at the top. That's where that seam that has the decorative, that's where that lands, right about there. I did purposely try to make this sleeve very accurate. The sleeve cap is very accurate, so that you should not have to do a bunch of easing, because when I do easing, I prefer it to just be done as I sew. I don't particularly like the 2 rows of stitching way of easing things. That's just me. And then the lower part of the sleeve lines up right there. And now you just sew around a 1/2 inch seam allowance, both sleeves, and the exact same steps to adding the sleeve lining to the lining. So just to go over, I've put in the first sleeve, and you know you have it correct. That under sleeve seam is just above a couple inches from your side seam. There's no seam. It's that notch that matches the side seam of the jacket. And then the back of the sleeve, this is the upper, this is the lower. That longest seam is about 1/4 of the way down of the arm's eye. So just to give you a point of reference of kind of what the sleeve position looks like correctly set into the body of the jacket. Okay, so we are rounding the home stretch here. So your jacket's fully assembled. Now you're going to take your cuffs that you already sewed together and pressed open and then folded in half. Because this is a solid ribbing, I don't have to really worry about a right side or a wrong side because it's the right side on both sides. But if you were to do like a striped rib, you want to make sure that your ribbing, that your stripe is on the outside. So you want to make sure that the stripe is your right side and that you are putting that right side to the right side of your sleeve. The seam of the cuff matches up to the first lower seam, which is the closest to your underarm, basically. So I just pin this, and you'll want to stretch stretch and baste at 1/4 inch all the way around, and you can just leave these folded up for now. Do that for both sleeves. And then you're going to attach the placket and the waistband, which we already assembled before we started. And the way that's going to work is you will match right sides to right sides, placket here. You will stretch and pin your waistband around, having the other side of the placket there. So it looks like this. Sew that around a 1/2 inch also. Okay, so we've attached the waistband and placket to the bottom of the jacket. Now we are going to add the lining. You're going to put the right side of the lining to the right side of the jacket. By putting it inside the lining. And then you're going to line up at the collar. You're going to fold the ribbing down to the inside so it's sandwiched between the lining and the self fabric. I always start at the center front. I've added more of the zip tape to be a little piping edge trim on the other side. I don't go over that in the pattern instructions, but just so you know what that is when you're doing this. So line it up just like the instructions say. And you'll match it all the way around the collar. Excuse me, all the way around the collar and the neckline. I line up the center of the neckline. Again, that rib knit collar is facing down towards the right side of the jacket. You'll line up the shoulder seams of the lining and the self fabric. And then what you're going to do is you're going to sew the neckline. Then you're going to come to the bottom of the lining and the bottom of your placket and rib knit. You're going to pin that just like you did it on the bottom of the body of the jacket. And you're going to match it, line it up at the bottom all the way across. Pin there to there. You're going to sew 1/2 inch seam allowance there, 1/2 inch seam allowance here, and then I'll show you the next step. Okay, so now your lining is attached to the waistband, your jacket is attached to the waistband, and you've sewed your neckline. What you're going to do now, your center front pulling taut, you are going to match up, well, you're basically going to fold your waistband in half. When that's pulled taut, where the placket meets the jacket and the lining face, or the facing of the lining meets the jacket, those points are going to meet up right here, like that. You pull this taut, and you are going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way from where the notch was up top at the neckline, all the way down through the seam allowances of the placket and the facing, all the way through the fold. And you'll do that on both sides. Then you're going to trim the corners up there and there, and you should trim down the neckline and clip into, but not through, the stitching to help the curve of the neckline with the collar attached and everything else. I just clip all those curve seams to help it be able to curve and move. So now that you have trimmed the corners and clipped the curve of the neckline, everything is attached. You are going to take the wrong side of the waistband. You are going to push the point of the placket in temporarily, and you're going to fold the waistband up, wrong sides together, matching up those placket seams. And from where the placket is attached all the way across to the other end of the placket, just inside the jacket, you are going to baste these seam allowances together so that the fold of the rib knit stays folded all time. You're going to leave the placket part open. You're going to start just after the placket and baste all the way across to this other side. All the way across. Okay, so now you've basted those two edges of the ribbing waistband together. And now we are going to berth the jacket, turn the jacket from the wrong side to right side out through the hole we left in the one sleeve lining. And I like to go all the way through to the points first at the center front neckline and the bottom of the jacket, the placket corner, and pull those out. And if I have to, I'll use my points turner to make them really clean. But yeah. Now put the lining into the sleeve. Make sure that that's not twisted. It's all lined up there. We can show you how to attach that next. Do the same thing for the other side. You want to get that all lined up nicely. So now you have your jacket. And what I do now, before I attach the lining to the cuff, I will go and press this whole thing, and I will top stitch from the center back around the neckline, down the center front, down the placket, across the placket, and up to the top of where the placket meets the body of the jacket. So like a backwards J. And I'll do that on both sides at 1/4 inch top stitching. And I'll go do that and come back and show you how to attach your sleeve lining to the cuffs so that everything is completely concealed. And then all you have left to do is to add your closures. So for my closures, I typically use a ring snap. You can use magnets. You can even put in a separating zipper. If you do, you need to adjust your center front a little because there's not going to be the same amount of lap, right over left or left over right, depending on who you're making it for. But how I do it, and I don't mark the closures on the pattern itself because I like to kind of decide where those closures land. I base it off the fullest part of the chest, determine where that is on me, on the jacket, or the person I'm making the jacket for. So let's say the fullest part is here. I would then use the gauge and space it off of that point, going this way and this way. That way, the fullest part, where the most stress of the jacket closed would be, there is a closure, if that makes sense. The way I do the closures is I chalk a line a 1/2 inch in from the center front all the way down. I determine my spacing, and at that 1/2 inch, I will mark where I want the closures to go. Bringing it in a 1/2 inch with a 24L size ring snap, that 1/2 inch makes it be over here and not all in the seam allowance, and gives a nice symmetrical edge between the snap and the center front. So chalk a 1/2 inch line, mark where you want your closures to go, and then you can apply your closures the method that you choose to use. The one thing I do is I will do the closures between here and the placket, and then on the placket I typically will space out 2, but again a 1/2 inch in, putting 2 down here. On children, sometimes 2 can be tight, especially if it's a 24L snap versus a smaller snap. If you're making something lightweight, if your fabric is a lighter weight fabric like this, you can get away with the strength of the snap being enough to be a smaller size snap on the children's. But on the adult, you need it to be at least a 24L just for the strength of holding the jacket together. So now you don't have to do that first. Let me show you how to attach the lining to the cuff, and then you go through and do your closures. So I go to the sleeve and I turn it right side out with the lining, keeping that cuff still folded up towards the sleeve So that's the sleeve without the hole. And this is the sleeve with the hole. So what I do is I first make sure that my sleeve is all lined up, that the seams of the upper and the lower sleeve match up to those on the self, on the outside sleeve. And I basically pick one, and I will use a clip, or you can pin it here so that you can turn it right side out. Okay, so I've clipped that seam. You have your hole here. You're going to pull the sleeve through, and where you have clipped the lining, you are going to unclip, holding that still in place. You're going to take the lining, the right side of the lining, and you're going to match it up to the right side of what is your sleeve, basically, your outer. And you're going to pinch that there. And then you're going to sew a 1/2 inch, and I usually just take it to the machine and sew a 1/2 inch, lining up to the cuff all the way around. You're just going to shift the sleeve itself out of the way, do it all the way around. Then
just to show you when construction is completed.
When you pull it right side
this is an adaptive length in a size small.
To the sleeve.
It's a custom
cuff.
Jacket done for a client.
And then when you pull your sleeve all the way out, it's completely concealed. The cuff seam allowance is completely concealed, as is your sleeve and your lining. And then for the other side, you're going to go through the same hole, same thing. You attach to a seam over here. You just got a longer tunnel to go through. You pull it back out this hole, switch the right sides to the right side of the sleeve, stitch a 1/2 inch all the way around, pull it back out, turn the whole thing right side out. So when you've sewn that, as you can see, it's completely concealed. Completely concealed on the other side. And now I'll go through the hole again and do the same thing to the other side. So now you've attached both sleeve linings to the sleeves. Everything's enclosed. The last step before you apply your closure choice options, you're going to close up the hole. I typically pin this, just folding the 1/2 inch seam allowance in, and then just stitch all the way down. If you want to be extra, you can hand stitch that because it's inside of the sleeve. I just do a little edge stitch and close the hole.